By the time the first Soviet shell struck Berlin, the war was already lost, but no one inside the city was allowed to say it. That first impact, a thunderous explosion echoing through miles of concrete and smoke, signaled more than the beginning of the end. It was a warning that the reckoning had come, that the sins of a dying empire were about to be repaid in blood. It was April 1945, and Berlin was no longer the capital of a triumphant Third Reich. It was a fortress of fear, surrounded by enemies and suffocating under the weight of its own lies. Hitler's promises of a 1,000-year empire had withered into rubble. The once proud boulevards were cratered and broken. The subways were filled with civilians hiding from the world above. The city was starving, burning, waiting. From the west, the American and British armies had already carved their way deep into German territory, but it was from the east that terror approached. The Soviet Union, brutalized, betrayed, and unrelenting, had crossed into the heart of Germany with one objective: take Berlin and destroy what remained of the Nazi regime. They came with overwhelming force, over 2.5 million troops, thousands of tanks, and a vengeance sharpened by 4 years of hell on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had seen what the Nazis had done in places like Leningrad, Kharkov, and Stalingrad. Now, they would bring the war to Hitler's doorstep. And what of the Führer? He was still there, buried beneath Berlin, entombed in a reinforced concrete bunker, giving orders to phantom divisions that no longer existed. Surrounded by loyalists, secretaries, and poison capsules, Adolf Hitler refused to flee. In his delusion, Berlin would hold, miracles would come, armies would rise from nothing. He would never surrender. But above his bunker, the city was already dying. The German war machine had collapsed, the Luftwaffe was grounded, the once feared Wehrmacht was broken. Berlin's final defenders were a scattered mix of old men, boys, and fanatics. The Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia, had been scraped from the population's leftovers. The too young, the too old, the too desperate. Teenagers were handed single-shot anti-tank weapons and told they were soldiers. Mothers and daughters filled water canisters from cratered streets. Civilians were warned, fight or be executed for cowardice. As the Soviets closed in, Berlin prepared for annihilation, and the world watched, knowing what was coming. Over the next 2 weeks, the city would become a battleground unlike any other in modern history. House-to-house combat, tanks in narrow alleys, fire in every direction. Civilians crushed between collapsing walls and collapsing governments. German soldiers digging trenches in gardens. Soviet artillery reducing entire blocks to ash. This wasn't just the end of a war, it was the death of an ideology. A final exorcism of a regime that had slaughtered millions, destroyed nations, and fed the world a dream made of nightmares. And when the smoke cleared, Berlin would be unrecognizable. Hitler would be dead, the Third Reich would be gone. This is the true story of the Battle of Berlin, the last stand of Nazi Germany. The final chapter of a war that changed the world forever. By the beginning of 1945, the outcome of World War II in Europe was no longer in doubt. Nazi Germany was bleeding from every front. The Western Allies had stormed across France, liberated Paris, and crossed the Rhine. The British and Americans were rolling into the heart of the Reich. German cities like Aachen and Cologne had already fallen. The skies belonged to Allied bombers. The industrial heart of Germany was in ruins. But Berlin, Hitler's capital, was not their prize. That task fell to the Soviet Union. In the east, the Red Army had turned the tide long ago, first at Stalingrad, then at Kursk, and now, with a vengeance sharpened by unimaginable suffering, they were pushing westward. Stalin's orders were clear: take Berlin before the Western Allies do, not just for strategic reasons, but for symbolic ones. This was about justice. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. It was one of the most astonishing military operations of the entire war. Over 2 million Red Army soldiers surged across the frozen Polish countryside. Entire German defensive lines collapsed in days. Town after town fell. What was left of army group couldn't hold them. In just 3 weeks, the Soviets advanced over 300 miles straight into German territory. They crossed rivers, smashed through fortifications, and tore open the gates to the heartland of the Reich. By late January, Soviet spearheads were less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Panic spread through the capital. Civilians packed what little they could and fled west, terrified of what the advancing Red Army might bring. Many had heard what happened in East Prussia, where Soviet soldiers, enraged by years of Nazi brutality, took merciless revenge on German civilians. Some ran, others died. Most simply waited, trapped in a city that had no way out, and yet Hitler did nothing. He refused to evacuate the city. He insisted Berlin would never fall. He believed that the Western Allies and the Soviets would eventually turn on each other. He even fantasized that he could drive a wedge between them and somehow survive the war. Delusion had become doctrine. Inside the Führerbunker, the war maps no longer reflected reality. Hitler issued orders to imaginary divisions. Entire corps he believed were fighting simply no longer existed. His generals, those who dared question him, were replaced or ignored. His trusted allies like Himmler and Goering were quietly preparing their own exits, but none of that mattered to the Red Army. By April, 3 massive Soviet fronts were converging on Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov led the 1st Belarusian front from the east. Marshal Ivan Konov pushed up from the south, and Marshal Rokossovsky swept down from the north. Together, they would encircle and crush what remained of the Nazi regime. Berlin had become a trap, a symbolic fortress, the final battleground of a war that had consumed continents, and with every passing hour, the noose drew tighter. At 4 a.m. on April 16, 1945, the horizon east of Berlin exploded with fire. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces, rocket launchers, and heavy guns lit up the darkness, unleashing one of the most intense bombardments of the entire war. More than 1 million shells were fired in the first 24 hours alone. The thunder rolled for miles. The ground shook like it was alive. Trees snapped, bunkers collapsed, forests simply vanished. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had launched the final assault on Nazi Germany. His objective, break through the last major German defensive line protecting Berlin, the Seelow Heights. The Seelow Heights were a series of elevated ridges overlooking the Oder River Valley. The Germans had fortified them extensively. Trenches, machine gun nests, mines, and tank obstacles all stretched across the terrain. General Gotthard Heinrichsei, one of Germany's most experienced and respected defensive commanders, had pulled back his troops before the Soviet bombardment began, letting most of it hit empty positions. When the Red Army surged forward after the barrage, they were met not with surrender, but with a wall of lead. The terrain worked against them. The fields had been flooded. The roads were choked with mud. Soviet tanks bogged down. Infantry units found themselves exposed. German artillery and anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions on the heights. Soviet losses mounted rapidly. Zhukov had underestimated Heinrichsei's defense, and Stalin was watching, under immense pressure to succeed and to reach Berlin before Marshal Konov's forces advancing from the south. Zhukov intensified the assault. Reinforcements were thrown in, more artillery was brought up, airstrikes pounded the German lines. The battlefield turned into a meat grinder. By April 18, after 3 days of brutal fighting, the Seelow Heights began to collapse, but the cost was staggering. The Red Army suffered over 30,000 casualties in just those 3 days. For every step forward, hundreds fell. The German defense was ferocious, but it was also doomed. There were no reserves, no fresh units, no fuel, no air support. The Wehrmacht, once feared across all of Europe, had been reduced to scattered fragments. Old men and boys manned machine guns. Entire units were held together by fear and stubbornness alone. As the Soviets finally surged through the heights, what remained of the German defenders fell back toward Berlin, the last refuge. And now there was nothing standing between the Red Army and the capital. On April 20, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling the outskirts of Berlin. The shells could be heard from the Führerbunker deep beneath the Chancellery. Above ground, the city was already in chaos. Fires broke out in residential blocks, rail stations were shattered, food supplies dwindled, hundreds of thousands of civilians were still trapped. Inside the bunker, Hitler met with his staff. Some congratulated him on his birthday, others watched silently, knowing that it was probably his last. Outside, the thunder of Soviet guns grew louder. The Seelow Heights had fallen, the ring was closing, and Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire, was now fully exposed. The final siege had begun. By April 23, 1945, Berlin was completely encircled. The Red Army closed in from the north, east, and south, tightening its grip street by street. What followed was not a conventional battle, it was a descent into hell. The once grand capital of the Nazi regime was now a twisted labyrinth of rubble, fire, and desperation. The city was dying, but not without a fight. The German defenders were a patchwork force. Cobbled together from the remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS units, hastily formed Volkssturm militias, and the Hitler Youth. Many were barely teenagers, some just 12 or 13 years old, clutching Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons, and sent into battle with no experience, little training, and no real hope of survival. Their orders: hold every street, every block, every building, no surrender. For the Soviet troops entering Berlin, it was a nightmare. The city had been fortified at every level, barricades blocked intersections. Machine gun nests were hidden behind furniture and apartment windows. Entire buildings had been rigged with explosives. Sewer systems were used for ambushes. Snipers fired from church spires and bell towers. Soviet tanks couldn't move safely without infantry support. Every corner hid a potential trap. Fighting happened house to house, room to room, floor to floor. Soldiers bled for staircases. Men died over doorways. When a building couldn't be cleared by rifle or grenade, the Soviets brought in flamethrowers or tank shells, leveling entire blocks just to push forward a few meters. The smell of burning wood, flesh, and oil mixed with the smoke. The air was thick with dust and screams. The wounded cried out from basements that had become makeshift hospitals. Medics were overwhelmed. Water was scarce. Electricity was gone. In the subway tunnels, tens of thousands of civilians sought shelter from the carnage above. Mothers clutched children in the dark. Elderly men lay dying with no one to treat them. Every explosion sent tremors through the ground. People prayed. Some simply waited in silence, unable to believe what was happening. For the Red Army, this wasn't just another offensive, it was vengeance. The memory of what Nazi Germany had done to their homeland, the starvation of Leningrad, the massacre at Babi Yar. The horror of Stalingrad burned hot in the minds of Soviet soldiers, and in many places discipline broke down. There were widespread reports of looting, of rape, of civilians beaten or killed without cause. Not every Soviet soldier participated. Some tried to protect civilians, sharing rations or guiding people to safety. But in many parts of the city, revenge took hold and no one was safe. Yet Berliners continued to resist, some out of loyalty, some out of fear, others because they simply had nowhere left to run. At night, the skies glowed red as fires raged uncontrollably. The Reich Chancellery was bombed repeatedly. Hospitals were overflowing. The smell of rot and cordite filled the air. Above ground, block by block, the Red Army advanced at a staggering cost. The Soviets lost thousands of men every day, but they pressed on, determined to end the war here at its source. Berlin had become a giant tomb, a place where dreams, regimes, and countless lives were coming to a final, violent end. Beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, buried under the Reich Chancellery in a dim concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler lived out his final days. The world above was burning. The Red Army was advancing block by block. Yet here, deep below the earth, Hitler clung to delusions of salvation. The Führerbunker was a bleak and claustrophobic place. Narrow corridors, flickering lights, and the constant pressure of being trapped underground created a growing sense of paranoia. Outside, the world was collapsing. Inside, the man who had once commanded the most powerful war machine in Europe had become a shadow, trembling, angry, and increasingly irrational. By late April, the truth was impossible to ignore. Hitler's armies were broken. His generals were either dead, captured, or disobeying orders. He received reports hourly. Soviet troops were within a few kilometers of the bunker. German divisions were disintegrating. Ammunition was running out. Civilian resistance was nearly gone, yet Hitler refused to surrender. He continued to issue orders to non-existent divisions. He insisted that General Felix Steiner would launch a counterattack and save Berlin, but Steiner had no such force. His so-called relief army existed only on paper. Hitler was commanding ghosts. On April 22, during a staff meeting in the bunker, Hitler finally snapped, pounding his fists and shaking with rage. He admitted for the first time that the war was lost. He blamed everyone, the army, his advisors, the German people. If the German people are not strong enough to fight, he said, they deserve to perish. From that moment on, the bunker became less a command post and more a tomb. On April 28, Hitler received news that shattered whatever illusion he had left. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, one of Hitler's most loyal followers, had secretly attempted to negotiate a peace deal with the Western Allies. Hitler exploded in fury. He ordered Himmler's arrest and branded him a traitor, but it was too late. The Reich was coming apart from within. That same night, in a surreal twist, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in the bunker's small briefing room. It was a short ceremony, quiet, awkward, and strangely normal amid the chaos. Champagne was shared. Uades smiled, but everyone present knew what was coming. On the morning of April 29, Hitler dictated his final will and political testament. In it, he blamed the Jews for the war, denounced his betrayers, and named Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. He instructed that his body be burned after death to avoid the humiliation of capture and display. And then the final preparations began. On April 30, sometime around 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private quarters. Guards stood outside the door. A few minutes later, a single gunshot rang out. Inside, Hitler was dead. He had shot himself in the temple. Eva had taken cyanide. Loyal staff carried their bodies up the narrow bunker stairs, doused them in gasoline in the garden above, and lit the fire. Soviet shells were falling only a few hundred meters away. The war would continue for a few more days. But the man who started it was gone, and with him, the twisted heart of the Third Reich stopped beating. With Adolf Hitler dead, the Nazi regime began its final, silent unraveling. But the fighting wasn't over. Despite Hitler's suicide on April 30, the guns kept firing. In some parts of Berlin, German SS units still refused to surrender. Soviet forces had to clear every remaining stronghold street by street. The Reichstag, the symbolic seat of Nazi power, became the last major objective. On May 1, Red Army soldiers launched a final assault on the building. Fighting was fierce. The Germans had turned it into a fortress, walls lined with sandbags, stairwells mined, snipers positioned in the dome. Hundreds died in the struggle, but by nightfall it was over. In a moment of enormous symbolic weight, Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, a red banner fluttering in the smoke-filled sky above the ruins of Nazi Germany. A photograph of that moment would become one of the most iconic images in history. Meanwhile, inside the bunker, those who remained faced their own ends. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and closest political ally, poisoned his 6 young children in their sleep. Then he and his wife Magda went into the Chancellery garden where he shot her and then himself. Others tried to escape Berlin in disguise. Many failed, some were caught, some were executed. others vanished. But Berlin itself was finished. On May 2, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, surrendered the city to the Soviets. The remaining pockets of resistance laid down their weapons. The Red Army now controlled every corner of the capital. In the days that followed, the true extent of the devastation became clear. Entire districts were flattened, fires still burned, corpses lined the streets and filled the craters. Infrastructure was non-existent: no clean water, no electricity, no functioning transportation. Civilians emerged from basements and bunkers into a landscape that looked like another planet. The human cost was staggering. The Soviets lost over 80,000 soldiers in the Battle of Berlin, with more than 280,000 wounded. German military casualties exceeded 90,000 killed, with another 150,000 captured. Civilian losses are harder to calculate. Some estimates place them between 20,000 to 100,000 dead. And then there were the atrocities. Tens of thousands of Berlin civilians were subjected to violence by occupying forces. Looting was rampant, mass rape was widespread. Soviet commanders struggled and often failed to rein in their troops. While many soldiers behaved with discipline and humanity, many others acted with vengeance and fury. It was, in every way, a tragic and complicated end. On May 7 in Reims, France, Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. On May 8, another surrender was signed in Berlin, officially ending the war in Europe. The Third Reich, once envisioned as a 1,000-year empire, had lasted only 12. Berlin, the beating heart of that vision, was now a shattered ruin, divided by the victors, destined to become the front line of a new global conflict, the Cold War. But for now, there was silence. The Battle of Berlin was over, a tyrant was dead, a regime was crushed, and for the first time in over 5 years, Europe could begin to heal. The Battle of Berlin was not just the end of a war, it was the ultimate collapse of a violent ideology. A city paid the price, its people bore the scars, and history was forever changed. Thank you for watching this in-depth look at the fall of Berlin. If this story moved you like the video, subscribe for more powerful moments from history, and let us know in the comments what story we should tell next. Until then, remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and if we forget what came before, we risk living it again.